Abel Sibanda, welcome to Troublemakers.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. Today we're going to talk a bit about participatory action research. Tell us, in your own words, what is it?
For me, participatory action research, each word in this means a lot and takes time to unpack. Let me be quick. The participatory element is to make sure that whatever outcome of the work that you're going to do involves as many people as possible, as many concerned people as possible. But the action part is that when you're researching, you are not just researching for communication purposes or just to disseminate information, but to actually inform your own decisions. And the research part is to gather data and make sure you interpret and find useful information from it. So participatory action research for me is relevant for organizing and specifically for activists and social movements, because oftentimes they don't have an opportunity to actually rely or gather any other information from outside. They are producing a lot of data as they work to produce their own results. But at the same time, the challenge is oftentimes this knowledge is often not considered serious in academic spaces, in elite spaces, if I can say that. So participatory action research is that process of involving people in informing and providing information and data that produces information that is then used to make decisions along the way for activists and for social movements to inform their actions.
So give us a concrete example of participatory action research that you were involved in.
Okay, thank you for that, because as someone who's been involved in a number of mobilization phases, I can tell that at first it was the gap that I saw from the mobilization that I've been part of. In 2016 in Zimbabwe, there were a lot of spontaneous movements which were popping up. And I think the frustration from seeing how they were interpreted by the media, and later on you start to see academic papers popping up, providing a certain narrative about the things that we were part of. And you'll be like, okay, this is not what we're doing. These were not our intentions. These are not the processes that we're involved on. So after that, during the COVID-19 period, there were a lot of mobilizations in Zimbabwe. And one particular one was a Zimbabwe Lives Matter movement, which was more of a digital movement, but at the same time, it had key fiscal moments, which also end up with arrests and repression from the state, of course. So with the young people that I was working on, and some of them, I don't even know their face in person because we're just interacting online, we just combined the pieces of information that we get, what was motivating our decisions and what actions were we taking and what corrections were we making based on the information that we're getting. For example, there was a day in August when people were planning to have a protest. So the first thing is, what is the reaction of the state? We're gathering information from media reports and also from social media of political players, including the police in Zimbabwe is quite active on social media. And we combine this information and really inform, are we going to get out on the streets? And even if we don't get out on the street, definitely there are people who are going to get out on the street. What actions are we going to take? So this information helped us to make sure that we were ready to respond when some of our colleagues were arrested who actually got out in the streets. So this was practical in practice, but at the same time, after all the mobilizations were done, we managed to consolidate this information, and we have already a paper that is to be published by the Review of African Political Economy. It's still a paper in review, but it has already passed the first review. So we are looking forward to have this information out in public for people to really understand what was actually happening in the background, not the streets mobilizations, not the X posts and those Facebook posts, but what was happening behind, what was informing the decisions behind.
Let's start with the action part of participatory action research. So why do action simultaneously with learning, with data gathering, with analysis, with research? Why do action concurrently? Why not first figure things out and then read the paper in the African Review of Political Economy and then take action later? Why integrate the two? Why do the action as part of the research?
So there's always this dichotomy that is often put out there where people have this strategizing on the other part, waiting for action, or people are just reactionary, then they do something, then later on sit to strategize. But for me and also the comrades that I work with, it's a matter of doing both at the same time. So when you see a situation that requires reaction, people have to react. But while it's reacting, you don't have to be blind to everything happening around you. You need to pay attention. I think that's where the part of the research comes in. You need to pay attention to what's happening around you, because there are certain nuances that are happening which can actually inform you to do better what you're doing. Because in mobilizing and that action, often direct action, you are in the moment, you're present in the moment, and sometimes the momentum takes its own life. But if you are aware, you need to pay attention of what's happening surrounding you. You can actually make sure that you now amplify your actions to produce better results compared to just acting and waiting for a certain moment to reflect and all that. And there is also the convex to that is if you wait for the data that is gathered by other people. I think that's where most of my frustrations have been, and also young people who are in this space trying to do participatory action research, is that oftentimes the interpretations which come from academics and NGOs and other institutions is often generalized in a way, or it is informed by a one-size-fits-all kind of understanding. Social movements, I love to call them experimentations all the time. You are in an experiment, so you can't really too much rely on what has been written, what has been done. Social movements, they take the life of their own. And when you are in the moment, if you are paying attention, you make decisions along the way. But those decisions should not just be reactionary decisions. They have to be logical. They have to be methodical. What is informing that decision? What kind of planning need to be done after the action? So I think as far as I am more interested in action, I am very much aware that that action should be informed by an understanding of your surroundings and a more methodical kind of interpretation of what is happening.
So this is interesting to me because I often feel, even as a researcher, that we have reduced reality, extracted it, put it on a paper or on a website or in a PDF. In any case, it becomes this very static thing, a little bit divorced from our reality. And I think movements of all the kind of formations of human beings on the world are perhaps the most living in the complexity of reality, because things are always changing. Movements move, you know. The forces of the world are so dynamic. And I think as you're explaining participatory action research, that's what's coming to my mind, that, the forces of change, the winds of change are always, the tug of war between different powers is always kind of happening. Even when we're asleep, it's out there in the world, things are changing. So there's like this kind of honesty about reality that's in participatory action research. It's inherently not maybe as extractive as other research methodologies. Would you say that?
Yes. And I think that's where the idea of each social movement as an experiment come from, because understanding that each time forces, we talk about forces of capitalism, authoritarianism and all that, they are scheming and trying to come up with new ways of dealing with issues. So if you organize this time around, the interactions with those systems next time, they're not going to be the same. But there's another thing that I've also noticed, that oftentimes the movements which get attention, maybe academic or popular media attention, are those which blow out of the regular. But there are movements, there are people organizing on their day-to-day lives, and these are often not documented. But these are the kind of organizing that actually produce results at the smallest level of a community, at a village, at a district level, at a provincial level, at a state level, or at a national level. But these are more localized kind of mobilizations. And these kind of mobilizations or organizing are not getting attention. Why? Because the documentation happens when something blues out and everyone pays attention to it. So for me, it's an approach of understanding that our day-to-day life, we produce our own history, we produce our own information, and we are producing something new. Because, of course, we can give reference and learn from the past, but we are producing something new. And in producing that something new, we need to understand it. And when we understand it, we need to put record on it. And I think this is my foremost emphasis. Because oftentimes the history of oppression, we talk of colonialism, you talk of capitalism, it is based on record keeping. There are lots of data, lots of information, lots of histories which are written to cement the system in a way. But the histories of struggles, and specifically in Africa, have always been these, at worst they are misinterpreted or over-interpreted, and people giving meaning on something that carries no meaning.
It might have been benign. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so all this happens because people, systems, they like order, and the world of social movements is not one of more of an order in the sense of how the systems are structured usually. So oftentimes the interpretation from the academia outside the movement space is that it has to have a certain frame. When A happens, it must be because of B that it happened before or whatever. But that is a problem, because when you overinterpret things, you divorce it from the reality of where it happens. And when you do that, the people who actually did the activity, who mobilized, who pushed for change, they feel disconnected from the product. And again, if other people want to learn from those people, are now learning based on a lie. So I strongly feel that participatory action research should be a way of putting record of what happened. What processes did we take to reach this point? What contradictions were happening when we were making a decision? And how do we interpret the results? Because oftentimes people celebrate something outside, then we say, okay, this is not what we're really pushing for. So the results that the outside world is saying is a win might not be technically a win to that particular community. So I feel like participatory action research is a matter of making a close to accurate record of what's happening, and this can actually work as a learning point for other people mobilizing and organizing in other contexts. But is the idea of competing with systems which are so good at keeping record and controlling the narrative. So there is a narrative shaping part to participatory action research.
So let's talk about the participatory aspect of participatory action research. Have you been in situations where maybe more formally trained kind of researchers, intellectuals, academics have worked with people who wouldn't otherwise see themselves as researchers?
It is interesting because I'm almost straddling both worlds, where I'm also much engaged in the formalized academic world, but also organizing with social movements and activists. So there is a pool of academics who really understand the need to make sure that there is the participatory element in gathering data, interpreting data, and publication of whatever the findings of those studies are. But there is always a challenge, because in the academia, there is always a debate of what counts as research. And research is usually something that comes from research institutions, some people with certain qualifications and all that. So for me, the participatory element is also pushing beyond the leadership of or the tutelage of academics, but activists themselves with their lived reality, working with their peers, producing knowledge.
And considering that as authoritative.
And considering that as authoritative and name it research. Why? Because the debate of what counts as research is already designed to silence certain voices, certain perspectives. So when you are just a young person in a small community and produce a narrative of what happened with rigorous analysis, as long as you're not qualified to be producing research, there's always that debate, can this count as research? And this peer review kind of discussions within the academic cycles, sometimes it makes things conform to a certain narrative or a certain understanding, way of producing knowledge. The problem with that is you then produce uniform documents, uniform reports. So that uniformity has a lot to leave out than to include, because there are many ways of knowledge production and knowledge packaging that is out there and is often left out and not considered as knowledge. So this, for me, a call to action, if you will, that people in the academia, if they really want to understand social movements, they should understand that the level of partnership they need to engage with social movements and activists, because it's not them coming to a partner, but for them to be part of the process, because that's where the action comes in. At what point do people allowed to react based on that information? You are not just collecting data and go and sort that data somewhere and interpret results from somewhere. Are you interpreting the results with the community? After that, are you providing recommendations of change of course of direction, course of action at that point? So academics should have this activist mentality when you are working with activists, when you are interacting with social movements, because they need that information on hand to produce results. You don't have to wait for peer review for you to inform a decision. You gather data, and data is showing you that there is risk. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to wait for the peer review process 6 months, 1 year, 2 years for you to inform the social movement? So it's a process that research in itself should not be used as a process to get to somewhere, but a process to inform right now. So when you come to a community, especially for the externals, when you come from whatever university you're coming from, when you get into a social movement or a community and research with them on their work, make sure that you are ready to make sure that as you do the research, there is information that they can use to make decisions and produce better results.
So there's a conversation to be had here about, let's say, the commons. Where do we put our knowledge? Do we have access to knowledge? Are we able to get the information that we want or that we need or that could be helpful to us? And there's a whole conversation about access based on one's level of education. But what I'm trying to bring up here is more about, can we, get online and find what we need without having to pay money for it? Do we have access do our universities have access to libraries? Do our schools have access to databases of certain things? And where our publications, where our knowledge ends up, that's a very political thing to be considered, right?
Interesting. So there was a joke which was circulating around the academic circles. There was a screenshot of a paper on the inaccessibility of academic knowledge, and it was behind a paywall. You have to pay $35 to access an understanding of the inaccessibility of academic knowledge. And the situation gets worse because the people who do regular organizing, as I said, there is this layer which is often untapped at community level, people pushing their village heads and all that. Those people, when they want to understand something or they want to produce a knowledge product, they can't access some of these high quality knowledge products.
They're just Google searching for whatever search engine optimized thing comes up.
Information that is there. But there is another element. The AI that is now dominating the conversation is being fed a certain level of information. These underground mobilizations and this underground knowledge that is happening in communities is not captured. So when people even go...
It's not captured by AI?
AI, yeah, okay. So because the AI is being fed the knowledge that is already online, that is
publicly available. Yeah,
exactly. So that information, again, is being fed into AI models, and the information of the people experiencing certain things at a more community level is not being fed into this system. So if someone even goes on an AI model and says, okay, I need an understanding of ABC, they are fed this, I often call them middle class struggles, which are often captured, which are popular mobilizations at a certain level. So these struggles which are captured are not reflective of the struggles of the people at the bottom of the ladder. People at the community level who struggle every day, pushing their local leaders to produce changes that are more comfortable for them. So there's a dual problem. There is this inaccessibility where academic knowledge, you come to a community, collect data, you move out, you package it in a document, it's then logged on a firewall. But now, there is another layer. People in those communities, we know that digital connectivity in Africa is improving, steadily improving, but still there are so many communities which are not connected at the same level as others. In these communities, when they want to access that knowledge, they cannot easily access it because they don't have the connectivity. So that's another layer. But the third layer now is the availability of knowledge, even for those academics. They're also accessing information which exclude certain levels of mobilization, certain levels of organizing, certain levels of social movements. So it's multiple levels of gaps, which if we don't pay attention, can actually exacerbate the kind of elitist dynamics within the production of knowledge business.
Yeah, let's. I know we didn't set out to discuss AI per se, but I do kind of have a question that's coming to my mind here, hearing you talk about this. So, Noam Chomsky called AI a tool for mass plagiarism. And there's this kind of contradiction within knowledge and research and academia and all these kind of structures, where on one hand, you want knowledge to be freely available. And so when we write books, we do this very presumably socialist thing of citing other people's ideas, right? We build upon and expand and challenge and complicate other people's, problematize other people's ideas. We cite them with sort of like respect, for the fact that they went through some intellectual rigor, did some research, maybe gave us an idea to build upon, to challenge. And at the same time, we don't really, do we want to give these ideas to big tech? Do we want everyone and everything, to know what we're talking about? Is this a threat to us? This is kind of like a question that's coming up for me.
So I think I can connect it to your previous question, which was around what is considered the commons. And I think big tech came with to muddy the waters in a way in this conversation, because the problem with the big tech is that the monetization part of it, they're developing these models to make money. And if they are making money with our knowledge, where's the compensation?
Right.
Because we produce knowledge for public consumption and to move humanity to another level of understanding. Maybe by understanding my struggle, you can build better your struggle. But if this information is now sucked into a machine for someone to make money, that becomes problematic. And the best solution to this is just to make sure that the power that the AI leading companies, these tech companies have, is regulated. Because at the end of the day, you can talk about how people use social media platforms, considering them to be free, but they are taking all this information and monetizing it somehow without really the benefit of the people who are putting in the information. But in their own understanding, they see as if they're helping people connect. But what are people losing in the conversation? So for me, it's just a matter of the levels of regulation, and I think that's a longer conversation. What kind of regulation should be put in place? First, to make sure that some intrusive data collecting methods are really controlled. 1, 2, wherever there is this intellectual productions, they can range from arts all the way to academic productions. Are the people who produce this getting compensated somehow? Because this knowledge product is also contributing for a big company to get money. So I think that level of legislation would really help, because as far as we would like people to access information, there is other part to that conversation, which is people have got histories, they've got traditional practices, they have this community-based knowledge that is now publicly available and being monetized. But from our communities, most African communities, from my understanding, when we talk about sharing, we are not sharing to make money. We are sharing for enriching others.
Right.
If there is someone making money in the process, there's need for
let's talk about this this contradiction that sort of relates, and that's the contradiction of let's say plagiarism vis-a-vis the commons.
Yeah.
So on one hand, we want to build knowledge together. There is this kind of like force or this assumption amongst many of us that we are trying to better humanity and create a better world. So if we all have access to the knowledge that we need, that will presumably help. But we also see a lot of people like erased from the research process, and it sounds like participatory action research leans a little bit less toward that, and so might be kind of like a good methodology to limit the possibility of that happening. But still, we see people not credited as researchers when they did a lot of the work. We see women's ideas co-opted by men and then, kind of thought to be originated by men as like, the primary thinkers behind those things, even though maybe they weren't. So how do we navigate this contradiction?
I think that the primary thing is about attribution. The advantage of participatory action research is that the first users of that knowledge are the people researching and being researched on. So that is the primary, I think, benefit for that. Then the second layer is about attribution. When you use a knowledge product, you know where you got it, and you should acknowledge where you got it. Oftentimes, when researchers get into a community, get into a movement, or research a movement from outside, much of the credit goes to the person who did the research. But what was the role of everyone else who was part of this? Are we giving full attribution? Then the third layer is the most complicated one, where these AI models, they don't give credit when chugging out information. And oftentimes,
There are even like recently like citations of AI, right? Like this thing was created through such and such a bot, right?
where did it get the information? Because that information was somewhere and it was trained based on a package of information. So the raw now question is, what kind of regulation we need to put in place to make sure there is some form of attribution? And that then is connected to, if there is attribution and if someone is making money from the work of someone else, what kind of compensation should be there, something like that. But all this is because as knowledge is publicly available and people, we live in a capitalistic mentality-induced world where people want to make money. And by trying to co-opt other people's ideas as theirs or other people's knowledge as their own production, they make money out of it. So the whole conversation is also about how do we relate with the systems in this world. We're talking about capitalism, we talk about patriarchy. How do we relate with that? And we have to make sure that as communities also, we know how to organize and actually forward these arguments. And that is part of organizing, and also make sure that these injustices, as I see them, are also corrected along the way.
I'd like to encourage listeners to check out another episode we did some months back with Sarita Pariyar, who is a Delete kind of, you could say, researcher, but she organizes fellow Deletes to create knowledge through different mediums. I think if you've liked this conversation with Abel, Sarita's interview would also be a great one to listen to. Tell us, is there anything, Abel, that you would like to say about participatory action research that you haven't mentioned yet?
So for me, it's more of a re-emphasis of the key points that are important in this conversation. The first thing is that each and every community, each and every group of people, each and every social movement, each and every group of activists is an experiment itself with a unique knowledge, unique experiences. Let us not allow their experiences to be misinterpreted by externals. let's not allow their experiences or their knowledge to be exploited by externals. And let us respect the knowledge they produce. And for this, it is important because knowledge production for years has always been the domain of the elite. And it is time to make sure that we democratize knowledge production. This is important again because by relying on the knowledge that is produced by the elite, it comes from a different epistemology where people have a way of producing knowledge that is already standardized in a certain way. It leaves out a lot. So when you go back to communities, go back to that small unit, the social movement, a group of activists, what you're accessing there doesn't have a formula and do not come with research that imposes formula. Understand it and get the formula out of those experiences. So it's more going back to the communities, to the social movements, to the activists, and make sure that you understand how they understand things, not how you understood how knowledge should look like, how it should research look like, something like that. So I think the most important that one can take out from this conversation is that respect for knowledge that is being produced by activists and social movements on day-to-day basis, and respect it in a way that you don't exploit it by researching it and move away and interpret from somewhere else, but interpreting it with those people and help inform their own struggle, because these people are struggling for something or against something. What is the help of that knowledge if it is taken out of that community and being interpreted and published from somewhere else? That knowledge has to work primarily for those people, and everyone else would just benefit as a secondary option.
So I want to ask you about epistemology. Are there epistemologies that don't have space in the kind of typical research and academia scene? Are there epistemologies you would like to see, let's say like epistemologies of your people, however you define your people? Are there epistemologies that we should endeavor to really like humanize and include in, like not belittle? I think some of these ways of knowing around the world that aren't in kind of like mainstream academia are now kind of like marginalized. They're not scientific enough, or they don't have kind of like the masculine mechanical kind of like approach, and so therefore they're discredited a little bit. Are there some that you would like to see like more respected, more revered within kind of what we consider traditional research?
This is interesting because always when I interact with my communities in Zimbabwe, and especially in rural Zimbabwe, there is this infusion of the scientific understanding, technical understanding of things, but there is this interaction with nature that gives certain explanations and reverence to certain aspects of the natural environment. And when you want to bring the conversation into the mechanical, traditional academic sense, that in this community, when we understand, let's say, climate change, we are understanding it, the infusion of nature and the infusion of our spiritual understanding of the interactions that human beings have with the natural environment. When you bring the conversation that way, people do not really understand, because there is this understanding that everything has to be seen within this more scientific, logical framing. But there is the interaction between the spiritual understanding of things, no matter what that community specifically believe in terms of religion or whatever, but there is the spiritual element of understanding of things, then the practical day-to-day. But the interaction on how people now interpret how they live their lives becomes very important on the decisions they make. So when you come even with solutions and say, okay, we want to mitigate climate using these methodologies, in that community, when you become mechanical using this way of understanding things that is more, I would call Eurocentric in a way, that community will not understand you. That community will not understand you. So for me, I feel the primary objective is that we have this epistemology that has taken over as the primary way of looking for knowledge, understanding things. And finding out and discovering things and researching. That way should give accommodation to each and every community's interpretation of how you understand the world around you, how do you interpret the developments around you. So I strongly feel that it is time that researchers, especially those researching African social movements, African activists, African communities, should take more time in understanding how knowledge is produced in that particular community. There is one aspect. It is well known that oral passing of knowledge has always been dominant in African discourse. So there is a reservoir of knowledge that is obviously held by the elders in much of the communities that I come from. But when you come and want to research on a subject, it is easier to go to the sample that you have chosen, primarily maybe a group of young people. But knowledge production in that community is connected to this elderly generation that have seen something, and they pass that information gradually to the new generation. So when you come to that community, understanding that knowledge production in this community has a hierarchy kind of oral way of passing knowledge that is hierarchical and traditional and sometimes patriarchal. But for knowledge production purposes, understand how knowledge is passed in that community and make sure that you source knowledge where it is more concentrated per se. But that is often not the case when you want to understand things. Usually you set out your sample, you go and investigate that particular sample, but do you really understand that community is different hierarchies of what knowledge is being held? Women hold certain kind of knowledge that is not being shared by most men of that community. Men have certain knowledge that is not shared by women in that community. And when you get in that community without an understanding what kind of knowledge is being held here and here, you get lost in your interpretation. So it is important to understand how knowledge is produced, passed, understood, and interpreted in a community.
Could you close with a word of advice for maybe more privileged researchers, intellectuals, academics, about how to do participatory action research? I was a few years ago reading kind of like a journal submission by a researcher, I think from Sweden or Finland, and she was describing researching a social movement somewhere in Asia, and as part of her sort of like ethics approaching this research, she said to whatever extent it was possible, she would try to subject herself to like all the risks that the people she was doing the research about and with were subjected to. So if they were facing tear gas against the police, she would also be on the front lines. And of course, she went through a lot of the complicated factors about like how her identity would, complicate that kind of situation. But I think like the ethic coming through that has always kind of stuck with me was that there's not this bifurcation or divorce of researcher and activist. She was trying to find a way that there's some solidarity, there's some sincerity around how we're going to do this. Do you have any advice for people in that kind of position?
So the primary question that I always have with, especially those from a privileged position, trying to research a community, a social movement, or a group of activists is that, why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you producing this knowledge, and for who? So with a clear answer on those two questions, I'm producing this knowledge to inform social movements. I'm producing this knowledge to advance my career. I'm producing this knowledge for this and this. And the second question, for who? Are you producing this knowledge for a primarily privileged elite audience? Are you producing this knowledge for social movements to improve themselves? So when you have an answer to those questions, and preferably I would want someone who is doing the research out of solidarity, trying to make sure that there is better understanding, using academic rigor to interpret certain parts of the movement or certain parts of that group of activists. But when you have this interpretation, if it is done through solidarity, which means it will help informed decisions, and it automatically answers the second question for who. So the best advice that I can give is approach any research of a community, social movement, group of activists, whatever, with the spirit of solidarity. That will inform your actions. Understand there's the positionality issue that you just mentioned, that you are coming from a certain community. There are complications in actually blending in, and oftentimes there are even power dynamics with people that you are researching with. But when you are doing it out of solidarity, that is also, you are part of the action research component, the action part. When you understand that the power dynamics that are coming are affecting how things are being done, you're correct. That's the beautiful part about action research. You change along the way. When you feel like, here I feel like controlling the conversation, I am imposing certain elements, what it means is you self-correct. Why? Because the ultimate goal is solidarity. So for me, the advice is assess your intentions when interacting with these communities, when interacting with the social movements. And the primary goal should be about solidarity, and that will help you navigate and make it easier to decide on which steps to take while it's conducting the research.
Thanks so much for joining me, Abel. Since our conversation kind of at some point gravitated toward the knowledge commons, we will look for some links to websites, places that people have like liberated knowledge. There are some alternatives to JSTOR. You don't need to always buy the article. There are some great people that have stolen, what has been privatized and monetized and put it back into the commons. So we can find some links, where people won't have to be contending with a paywall all the time just to like read the things that we should be able to read. One of them, which inspires me, by the way, it's quite creative. If you're familiar with the game Minecraft, so there's a lot of Minecraft players, as I understand it, that have built libraries on Minecraft servers. So if you're in a country where certain books are banned or you just can't have access to them, you can find thousands upon thousands of books within the world of the game, So, there's a lot to explore in these things, but we'll try to share some links in the show notes so people will have a practical way forward, at least in that realm of our conversation too.
Yeah, thank you so much. The struggle continues.
Yes, thanks so much for joining me, Abba.
Hi! We hope you enjoyed the conversation on this episode of Troublemakers and feel inspired to stir up some good trouble in your own community. Do feel free to check out our other episodes and subscribe to Troublemakers podcast in your preferred podcast app. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook as troublemakers.podcast for all the latest updates, behind the scenes content, and sneak peeks of what's coming next. We also love to hear from our listeners. You can email us via troublemakerspodcast@gmail.com or simply drop a DM through our social media. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, take a moment and share it with a friend or leave us a review. It really helps us grow our community of troublemakers. Keep shaking things up.